Elias Thorne was more than a man to the people of the city. He was an institution, a bedrock of morality in an era of shifting sands. Known widely as the Golden Pillar, his reputation as a structural engineer was built not just on the strength of his steel, but on a perceived layer of uncompromising integrity. In the wood-paneled boardrooms of the city's elite, his word was the final authority. If Elias Thorne said a foundation was sound, no one questioned it. He moved through the gilded halls of high society with a quiet grace, his silver hair and tailored suits projecting an image of timeless reliability. His name was a brand of safety, a legacy he had cultivated with obsessive care, believing that the Thorne family name must remain unsullied by the common greeds that brought others down. Yet behind the mask of the city's most respected citizen lay a foundation that had been crumbling for 20 years. The higher his prestige rose, the more the secret at the heart of his greatest achievement, the skyscraper known as the Zenith, threatened to pull him into the abyss. 2 decades ago, during a suffocating recession, a younger Elias had found himself at a crossroads. The Thorne legacy was on the brink of financial collapse, and his family's future hung by a thread. In a moment of desperation, he accepted a bribe from a corrupt developer to overlook the use of substandard, cheaper steel in the supports of the Zenith's lower levels. He told himself it was a necessary evil, a bridge to a better future for his daughter, Sarah. He believed he could bury that compromise forever. As the years passed, that single act of cowardice transformed into a silent, internal rot. Despite his outward success, Elias felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The respect he received from the public felt like a mockery, a constant reminder of the fraud he had become. He spent his days inspecting the work of others with a ferocity that bordered on the fanatical, as if pointing out the flaws in others could somehow mend the fissure in his own soul. He had become a man of cold distance. His wife had felt the shift, a subtle hardening of his heart she could never quite articulate before she passed. His daughter, Sarah, an idealistic engineer, looked at him with a reverence that cut him deeper than any blade. She saw a hero, and Elias lived in constant terror of the day she might see the man behind the curtain. The life he had built was a masterpiece of misdirection, a sprawling estate of lies maintained with the precision of a master architect. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, where every accolade was another bar on the window. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The internal tension had reached a breaking point, much like the structural stress he spent his life calculating. He found himself avoiding the shadow of the Zenith, the glass and steel giant looming over him like a silent accuser. He knew every bolt and beam of that building better than anyone else, and he knew that somewhere in the dark, cold basement, the steel was not what it appeared to be. It was a Tuesday evening when the invitation arrived, hand-delivered in an envelope of heavy vellum. It was a summons to the 20th anniversary gala of the Zenith, a night intended to celebrate 2 decades of architectural brilliance. Elias held the heavy card in his cold, trembling hands, the gold leaf lettering shimmering under his desk lamp. This was the moment his legacy was supposed to be cemented forever. But as he stared at the invitation, a low, ominous vibration began to rise from the floor. It wasn't the usual thrum of the city's transit or the wind whipping against the penthouse glass. It was a deep, rhythmic shudder that made the crystal decanters on his shelf rattle against one another. It was a minor tremor, but to Elias, it felt like the first breath of a long, dormant beast waking up beneath his feet. The hidden sin was finally starting to speak through the foundations he had once betrayed. The dust from the tremor hung in the heavy air of the basement like a veil of gray ghosts, settling onto the cold concrete floors of the lowest maintenance level of the Zenith. Elias Thorne stood alone in the dim, flickering light, his expensive leather shoes crunching softly on the grit. To the world above, the shaking was just a minor geological hiccup, a footnote in a busy city's afternoon. To Elias, it felt like an interrogation. He moved his high-powered flashlight across the massive support pillars that shouldered the weight of 85 stories of glass and ambition. His heart drummed a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs as the beam searched the shadows. Then, the light caught it. A hairline fracture no wider than a strand of spider silk snaked diagonally across the surface of a primary load-bearing column. To an untrained eye, it was a negligible blemish. To the man who had engineered this giant, it was a scream echoing through a silent room. This was the exact coordinates of his shame, the physical manifestation of a compromise he had hoped would remain buried in the earth forever. Footsteps suddenly echoed on the concrete behind him, rhythmic and purposeful. Elias reflexively jerked his flashlight away from the crack, aiming the beam at the floor. "Dad, you're here early. I thought you were still at the office preparing for the gala speech." It was Sarah. At 26, she was the living embodiment of everything Elias had spent his life trying to protect. She carried her father's sharp, analytical features, but her eyes held a crystalline clarity that Elias had traded away decades ago. She was an idealistic young engineer, a rising star in the industry who didn't just love her father, she worshipped the golden pillar he represented. To her, integrity wasn't a choice. It was the only way to exist. She had been assigned to the routine post-tremor safety inspection, a task she approached with the solemn reverence of a priestess tending to a sacred temple. Elias felt a cold, oily sweat prickle the back of his neck. Watching her set up her ultrasonic testing equipment was like watching a child play in a minefield. He wanted to scream at her to leave, to get out of the building and never look back, but to do so without justification would be to invite the very scrutiny he feared. He had spent her entire childhood curating a legend of perfection, building a pedestal so high that the fall would be fatal for both of them. He stood frozen, his flashlight trembling slightly, as his mind drifted back to the origin of the rot. 20 years ago, the city had been a landscape of grey desperation, strangled by a recession that threatened to erase the Thorn name from the architectural world. Elias had been young, ambitious, and terrified of failure. Marcus Vance, a corrupt developer with a smile like a closing trap, had sat in his office with a briefcase of cash and a devil's bargain. Vance needed the Zenith built fast and cheap, which meant ignoring the specifications for high-grade reinforced steel. "It's high-grade enough," Vance had whispered, sliding the money across the desk. "No one will ever peel back the concrete, Elias. Think of your family. Think of Sarah's future." Elias had looked at a photograph of 5-year-old Sarah on his desk, her face full of innocent trust, and he had reached for the briefcase. He told himself it was a one-time sacrifice to ensure her safety, a bridge to a better life. He didn't realize then that he was building that life on a foundation of shifting sand. Since that day, Elias had become obsessed with outward perfection. He overcompensated by being the most rigid, most demanding engineer in the country. He would fire contractors for a single missing bolt or a minor deviation in a foundation pour. It was his penance, a desperate attempt to balance the scales of the universe. He believed that if he was perfect in 1,000 small things, the one massive lie would stay hidden in the dark. But the earth had moved, and the universe was finally coming to collect its debt. The silence of the basement was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic beep of Sarah's scanner and the distant, lonely drip of a pipe. Elias watched her, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Sarah was kneeling near the base of the pillar now, her brow furrowed as she compared the physical measurements to the original digital blueprints on her tablet. "That's strange," she murmured, her voice echoing in the hollow space. She tapped the screen, zooming in on the structural schematics. "Dad, come look at this." These original blueprints specified 12-inch reinforced carbon steel sleeves for these primary supports. But the physical dimensions here, the density readings don't match the specifications in the master file. She looked up at him, her expression one of pure, confused innocence, expecting her hero to provide a simple explanation for the discrepancy. It looks like they used a different grade of support entirely. It must be a clerical error in the digital archive, right? Elias felt the floor beneath him begin to dissolve as the shadow of his hidden sin finally touched his daughter's feet. Sarah stood with the tablet in her hands, her eyes searching her father's face for a reflection of the certainty she had always found there. It has to be an error in the archive, right, Dad? This steel doesn't have the density or the acoustic signature of the specifications. Elias felt his mouth go dry as he stepped closer, the shadows of the basement floor stretching toward the dark corners like fingers. He took the device from her, his fingers brushing against hers. He stared at the data, the scan screaming the truth he had buried. "You're overthinking it, Sarah," he said, his voice steady and low. "The sensors are likely calibrated for modern alloys. This was 2 decades ago. Resonance signatures change over time. You're misreading the data, honey. Don't let your enthusiasm cloud your judgment." He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was the first time he had ever intentionally lied to her about engineering, and the weight of that betrayal felt heavier than the building above. It was a calculated strike against her confidence to save his own skin. The air grew heavy as the afternoon bled into a bruised purple evening. On television screens, meteorologists were speaking in urgent tones about a storm system barreling toward the coast. The atmospheric pressure was dropping, and the winds were predicted to reach speeds that would test the very limits of the skyline. Every gust of wind seemed to rattle the windows of his car, a reminder that nature does not care for the reputations of men. For Elias, the approaching storm felt like a vengeful force, a divine hammer coming to strike the cracked anvil of his life. He left Sarah, claiming he had an urgent meeting, and drove to a sleek office downtown. There, he met the developer's successor, the heir to the man who had first corrupted him. The successor was younger, sharper, and lacked the pretense his father had used to mask his cruelty. He didn't offer Elias a seat, he simply leaned back in his chair, a digital file open on the desk. The man tapped a pen against the desk, a rhythmic, annoying sound that felt like a countdown. "I heard about the tremor, Elias, and I heard your daughter was the one inspecting it." The successor's smile was cold. "My father kept meticulous records of your collaborations. If a single word about structural instability reaches the press, those records will be in the hands of authorities before the first raindrop hits the pavement. You'll lose the house, the prestige, and your daughter will see the golden pillar crumble. Keep the building open for the gala. The zenith will stand, or we both fall." Elias returned to a home that felt like a mausoleum. The wind had begun to howl, a mournful sound that mirrored the growing rift between him and Sarah. They sat across from each other at dinner, the silence thick and suffocating. He watched her move with a grace he no longer felt he deserved to witness. Sarah was uncharacteristically quiet, her eyes tracing the lines of her father's face as if she were observing a stranger. The gaslighting in the basement had left a mark. She had seen the brief flicker of panic in his eyes. The warmth that had defined their relationship was replaced by a clinical distance. Elias tried to talk about his speech, but the words felt like ash. He told himself he was lying to protect her, but he realized he was merely protecting the ghost of the man she worshipped. Late that night, as rain lashed against the windows, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. The floorboards creaked under her weight, sounding like the building itself groaning in the storm. Her father's explanation didn't sit right with her mind. She knew her equipment, and she knew the math didn't lie. Driven by a desperate need to find the truth, she crept into her father's study. As she moved a stack of journals, she noticed a slight misalignment in the floorboards. Her heart racing, she pried the loose board up. Tucked away in the dark was a small leather-bound ledger. She opened it, her breath hitching as she saw her father's handwriting. There, dated 20 years ago, was a column of figures, recordings of illicit payments from Marcus Vance, each one corresponding to a shipment of substandard steel used in the foundation of the Zenith. The foundation of her world didn't just crack, it vanished. The paper felt cold against her fingertips, each page of the ledger vibrating with the force of a million unspoken lies. Sarah stared at the meticulous handwriting, a script she had always associated with wisdom and safety, now revealed as the blueprint for a monumental fraud. The illicit payments were listed with a chilling precision, marking the exact dates when the safety of thousands had been traded for the comfort of the Thorne family name. She felt a physical sickness rising in her throat, a realization that the very walls of the home she grew up in were funded by the compromises hidden in the basement of the Zenith. Her father's golden pillar was not cast in gold or steel, but in the brittle ash of corruption. The silence between the rain's rhythmic lashing was filled only by the sound of her own heart, which felt as though it were cracking along the foundation. When Elias appeared in the doorway of the study, he didn't offer a defense. The sight of his daughter holding the record of his shame seemed to age him by decades. He leaned against the frame, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the skyscraper had finally transferred onto his back. He spoke of the recession, the fear of losing everything, and the desperate need to provide for her. He framed his sin as a one-time sacrifice made so she would never know poverty. He argued that his decades of perfection were an attempt to balance the scales. To Sarah, the justification was offensive. He had used her existence as a shield for his cowardice, turning her love into a consequence of his greed. Her hero was a fraud, and the pedestal she had placed him on was dissolving into the mud of his deceit. As they stood in the wreckage of their relationship, the city outside was being devoured by the storm. The Zenith, miles away but connected to Elias by an invisible cord of guilt, began to groan under the onslaught. The record-breaking winds pushed against the glass facade, transferring immense lateral loads down to the foundation where the substandard steel waited like a ticking clock. The building was a living entity now, one that was beginning to scream as its internal organs were pushed to the breaking point. The structural tension was no longer a theoretical calculation. It was a physical vibration that Elias could feel in his marrow. The building's agony was his agony. Elias suddenly gasped, clutching his chest as a sharp pressure bloomed behind his ribs. It was a physical manifestation of his failing integrity, a stress-induced health crisis that mirrored the failing heart of his crowning achievement. He stumbled toward a chair, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray, his breath coming in short, desperate hitches. He looked at Sarah, not as a father, but as a man begging for a mercy he knew he hadn't earned. The irony was suffocating. He had spent 20 years trying to keep his heart and his building from failing, and now both were giving way at the exact same moment. During this collapse, a call came through. It was the old janitor who had spent 2 decades watching the shadows of the Zenith. For years, he had been the silent witness to the late-night deliveries of inferior materials. He spoke with a weary certainty. He told Elias that the basement was weeping, describing the sound of the foundation shifting against the soil. He was the face of Elias's suppressed conscience, a man who had stayed silent out of fear, but now spoke out of duty. The janitor's voice was the final hammer blow to Elias's pride. The television in the study flickered with a news alert. A reporter, struggling against the gale, pointed toward the dark silhouette of the Zenith. The first reports of structural instability were hitting the airwaves. Panic was beginning to ripple through the city as sensors detected the building tilting almost imperceptibly. The gala was in full swing, a room full of the elite dancing on a floor held up by lies, unaware that the foundation was surrendering to the truth. The storm had finally arrived to collect its overdue debt from the man who thought he could hide. The rain was a horizontal assault, a relentless deluge turning the city's skyline into a blurred, grey ghost. Inside the grand ballroom of the Zenith, the opulence was a jarring contrast to the chaos outside. Hundreds of dignitaries, draped in silks and tailored suits, sipped champagne beneath swaying chandeliers. Every guest was unaware that the ground beneath their feet was yielding to the weight of a 20-year-old deception. The music was loud enough to mask the deep groans of the steel frame, but it couldn't hide the vibration rattling the silver on the tables. It was a haunting thrum, the sound of a heart failing. In his private study, clutching his chest as a sharp pain subsided into a dull ache, Elias Thorne looked at the passport on his desk. His escape was plotted with cold precision. He could disappear, leaving the ruins of his reputation behind. But staring at the empty space where Sarah had stood, the wealth felt like lead in his veins. The golden pillar was a hollow shell, and the vacuum inside was filling with the suffocating reality of his choices. He wasn't just losing his name, he was losing the only person who had ever truly known the man he was supposed to be. Deep in the bowels of the skyscraper, the substandard steel met its match. A support beam, rusted from years of moisture, gave way with a sound like a muffled cannon. The vibration traveled up the spine of the building, reaching the gala as a sudden lurch that sent glasses shattering across the marble floor. The zenith didn't fall, but it tilted, a fraction of a degree, felt by every equilibrium in the room. The chandeliers swung in an ominous arc, and the music died as silence fell over the guests. The lie was leaning, and gravity was collecting its long overdue debt. Sarah didn't wait for an apology. While her father wrestled with his soul, she had already driven through the flooded streets. She wasn't going to save the building's prestige, but the people inside and the integrity her father once taught her to value. She entered the service tunnels, the water already rising to her knees. She knew exactly where the weakness was. The blueprints and the private ledger had mapped out the geography of her father's sin. She reached the lowest basement to apply hydraulic jacks, a desperate, suicidal attempt to buy enough time for an evacuation. Back in the study, Elias received a frantic text from Sarah. "I'm in the basement. I can hold the load. Get them out." The phone slipped from his hand. The realization hit him with force. His silence had become a death sentence for his child. Years spent hiding his crime had led her directly into the path of the collapsing giant he had constructed. His secret was no longer a weight. It was a weapon he had leveled at her heart. The cowardice that had dictated his life for 20 years dissolved, replaced by a frantic clarity. Elias threw open the heavy doors, ignoring the pain in his chest and the wind that threatened to knock him down. He drove toward the glowing needle of the zenith, white-knuckled as he dodged debris. He realized the only way to save Sarah was to destroy the myth of Elias Thorne. He needed the building evacuated immediately, and he knew the authorities wouldn't listen unless they understood the catastrophic failure. He would have to tell them everything. He would have to stand in the rain and scream his shame to ensure they took the threat seriously. He arrived at the perimeter where emergency lights cut through the gloom. Police struggled to maintain order as the building continued to groan. Elias pushed through the crowd, his face wet with rain. He wasn't the golden pillar anymore. He was a man unmasked, desperate and raw. He grabbed an officer, his eyes wide with honesty. He didn't ask for help. He demanded an evacuation because of the steel. He began to shout the truth, his voice cracking, calling out the specifications of his decades-old fraud. He stood before the world, ready to admit the building was a tomb. The rain was no longer just a weather pattern. It was a baptism of shame, cold and relentless. As it lashed against Elias Thorne's face, He stood at the edge of the police cordon, the blue and red lights of emergency vehicles reflecting in the deep puddles like fractured neon blood. To the world, he was still the golden pillar, but as he grabbed the lead detective by the shoulders, that pillar shattered into dust. He didn't just report a structural risk, he surrendered a life of lies. Over the howling wind and the panicked shouts of the crowd, Elias began to scream the truth. He detailed the exact grade of the substandard steel, the specific coordinates of the compromised joints on the 40th floor, and the name of the man who had paid him to look the other way 20 years ago. Reporters who had arrived to document a gala found themselves filming a public execution of a legacy. The cameras, those glass eyes that had once adored him, now recorded his disintegration in high definition. Every word he uttered was a hammer blow against the pedestal he had occupied for decades. He watched his social status evaporate in real time, replaced by a collective gasp of horror from the onlookers. For the first time in 20 years, his lungs didn't feel constricted by the invisible band of deceit, even as the world around him began to treat him like a monster. He didn't wait for the handcuffs that the officers were reaching for. Knowing that every second brought the zenith closer to a catastrophic failure, he broke past the perimeter. He sprinted toward the service entrance, his aging heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The building was groaning now, a deep tectonic sound that vibrated through the soles of his shoes. When the power grid finally succumbed to the storm's fury, the grand needle of the zenith plunged into darkness. Elias took the stairs, his breath coming in ragged, desperate hitches. He finally reached the lowest basement level, a subterranean cavern of shadows and rising water. The smell of ozone and wet concrete was overwhelming. In the center of the flooding chamber, he found Sarah. She was a small, defiant figure against the backdrop of massive, shifting machinery. She was trying to stabilize a temporary hydraulic brace, her hands slick with grease and icy water. She looked at him, and for a moment, the father-daughter bond flickered in the dark, but it was overshadowed by the cold realization of his betrayal. There was no time for apologies or explanations. Elias waded through the frigid water, his expensive suit soaking up the filth of the building's foundation, and threw his weight against the steel. Together, they fought the physics of a dying giant. The power of righteousness wasn't a gentle glow in this basement. It was a bone-deep ache and the grinding of teeth against the inevitable. As Elias heaved the brace into position, he felt the crushing weight of 20 years finally leave his soul. It was a strange, beautiful paradox. As the building threatened to literally crush his body, the spiritual burden that had hollowed him out was gone. He was no longer a fraud or a legendary engineer. He was just a father trying to fix a broken thing. The water was rising to their waists, turning the basement into a cold, dark lung. Above them, they could hear the thundering footsteps of hundreds of dignitaries fleeing the ballroom. The sound of lives being saved by the death of his reputation was the sweetest music Elias had ever heard. Every vibration that rattled his teeth was a soul reaching safety. A secondary support beam, weakened by 2 decades of silent corrosion, let out a scream of tortured metal. The ceiling sagged dangerously, and a torrent of water burst through a cracked pipe, pinning Sarah against the vibrating wall. The only way to keep the pressure from collapsing the primary exit corridor was a manual pressure release valve located behind a rapidly buckling bulkhead. To turn it and hold it required someone to stay in the path of the encroaching flood and the falling debris. Elias looked at the valve, then at his daughter, whose face was pale with exhaustion and shock. He realized the evacuation was nearly complete, but the path out for them was closing fast. He pushed Sarah toward the rising staircase, his hands slick with oil. He reached for the iron wheel of the valve, knowing that to hold it open meant he couldn't follow her. The building gave another violent lurch, and the final beam between them groaned, ready to seal the chamber forever and lock Elias in the heart of his own creation. Elias's hands were slick with cold oil as he held the manual release valve against the crushing rhythmic pressure of the surging flood. The iron bit into his palms like a dull blade, but the pain was a grounding force against the subterranean chaos. Above him, the final dignitaries were clearing the lobby, escaping the structural tomb he had built with his own pride 20 years prior. Below him, the foundations of his life were literally washing away in the dark. When the secondary beam finally gave way, it didn't kill him. It pinned him against the concrete pillar he had designed with such hubris. He watched through the spray as Sarah climbed to safety, her silhouette disappearing into the dim light. She looked back once, her eyes reflecting a heartbreaking mixture of grief and respect. For a moment, the silence of the basement returned, broken only by the rhythmic thudding of the storm and the creaking of the steel. The city woke to an irrevocably changed horizon. The zenith still stood, but it was a hollowed shell, its shimmering facade now a symbol of monumental deceit. The building would have to be dismantled piece by piece over the course of several years. It became a public autopsy of a legend, a reminder that the tallest structures are only as strong as their hidden truths. Elias Thorne did not die. He was pulled from the rising water by a team of divers who found him shivering, his body broken by debris, yet wearing a smile that none could fathom. He surrendered his freedom the moment he touched dry land, giving a final weary nod to the old janitor who stood by the perimeter, the only witness whose silence had finally been rewarded with the truth. The legal proceedings were a spectacle of shattered prestige. The developer's successor tried to pivot, attempting to bury Elias under litigation and lies, but the truth was an avalanche that could not be stopped. Elias offered no defense. He stood before the cameras, stripping away the layers of his own legacy with brutal precision. He detailed the bribe, the substandard materials, and the 20 years of silent, suffocating terror. He watched as his wealth was liquidated to pay for the dismantling of the tower and the compensation of the city. He saw his name removed from museums and universities. The golden pillar was being ground into dust, and Elias felt as though he were finally breathing without a weight on his chest for the first time in decades. Sarah sat in the back of the courtroom every single day. She had become the voice of a new movement within the industry, but she refused to be called a hero. To her, integrity was no longer a polished, effortless shield. It was a jagged, hard-earned scar. She understood now that her father was a criminal who eventually found the courage to trade his reputation for a moment of absolute honesty. She continued her career as an engineer, specializing in forensic analysis to ensure no other building would harbor such rot. She didn't carry the Thorne name with pride, but she carried it with an honest responsibility that had more structural integrity than any steel beam. Now, in the absolute quiet of a prison cell, the roar of the storm is a distant, muffled memory. Elias Thorne sits on a narrow cot, the rough fabric of his jumpsuit, a contrast to the silks of his previous life. He is a man who owns nothing but his conscience, and for him it is an incredible bargain. On his small table sits a photograph of Sarah. In it, she is working on a reconstruction site, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes clear. She had visited him once to tell him that she finally loved the man he was, not the legend he pretended to be. Hidden sin is a silent, aggressive cancer that eats the foundations of a life until the smallest tremor causes a total collapse. Uncompromising integrity, however, is the only shield that truly protects. Every day, every decision you make is a material choice for your own personal zenith. The world may admire the height of your tower, but only you know if the steel is pure. Build your life on the truth, for when the storm breaks, it is the only thing that will hold.